Hi, Holly. This is Ira, and I'm recording here my audio feedback on your statement of belief essay. My hope is that this feedback can be helpful as you move from this essay to the defining good argument in digital contexts, more full theoretical statement. I really enjoyed reading this very thoughtful, engaging essay, and I love your metaphor of the mirror. It's a really interesting, I think wise way of thinking about this. So, anyways, what I'm going to offer here are a set of questions, mostly, and things that I'd be interested to hear you say more about, not as criticism of the statement of belief, but rather as a tool for moving from that statement of belief to the more richly theorized, fulsome definition of good argument in digital contexts. So I'm just going to go through the paper and kind of offer notes or thoughts or questions as we go along. So you see good argument first and foremost as an interchange that is essentially, I would say, from these first two paragraphs, a form of self-fashioning. It's the passing back and forth of a mirror in order to challenge the listener to self-evaluate. And so this shouldn't be just a game of hot potatoes, and it shouldn't be seen as a matter of winning and losing, but rather as challenging and engaging with challenges in the process of self-fashioning via self-evaluation of the positions that we hold. So it's a really intensely reflective process, as you define it here. And I think your description of what it means to be arguing with a mirror and what it means to be holding the mirror for one another rather than simply being the mirror for one another is really strong here. And I'd like to actually encourage you to even pursue that further. Think through the logic of that even a little bit more. How specifically do arguments operate in this way? What makes some arguments able to operate in this way and other arguments not able to operate in this way? So when you say, note that the persons are not reflectors themselves, but rather they act as a structural support for the mirror to stand adjacent to the speaker so they may achieve the effect of having the listener see themselves standing next to their opposing arguments as opposed to facing them. I think this is fascinating, and I'd just love to hear another sentence or two of elaboration on that, and also a little bit about, so how then do some arguments work to achieve that, and while other arguments don't? And here we run into the difficulty we always sort of run into, which is that argument describes the entire process of interchange, and it describes the totality of one person's discursive production, and it describes the individual components of one person's discursive production. So really what I mean is how does the individual components of one person's discursive production become good in the sense that they foster this speaker adjacent mirroring? What makes that possible and impossible? You do mention that pacing may play a role. You would hope that this excludes anything resembling a rapid staccato, which would probably then be, let's say, not arguments over text message or certain kinds of arguments in the comments online. I'd be interested to hear you say a little bit more, though, about how this process, which the way you describe it feels very dialogic and interpersonal, how that operates in contexts that select for multilateral engagement, and how it operates in contexts that are mass-mediated in some way. And what I mean by that is, if the goal of argument is a form of self-fashioning, what about one-way arguments? These are mass-mediated arguments, like an advertisement or a presidential address, so on and so forth. Can they be good, or are they just excluded from being good? Do they need some other criteria? Can they fit under your criteria? Why or why not? Etc. And then also, what about cases of multilateral engagement where there are many different parties to an argument? Are those good in the same way? Does it become a hall of mirrors? Right? So that it's not just two people facing each other with speaker adjacent mirrors, but becomes an entire hall of mirrors. And if so, are the goals the same? Should they be the same? Should they not be the same? Why or why not? So those are some questions I think will be helpful as you translate this into specific digital contexts. I love your whole way of thinking about discomfort. It's personally very consonant to me. And actually you do a thing here that I think is A, pretty funny, and B, I recognize very much from my own writing, which is you articulate, in a sense, the core of that argument that's totally germane. I mean, it's totally part of what you're saying, but you articulate it in a footnote. And I'm mentioning that because I note this in my own writing. One of the things I've found over the years is one of my crutches as a writer is when I have something to say that in some way is really important, I'll often write it in a footnote. And I don't know, I think it's just sort of a psychological tick for me. I'm not saying that's the case for you. But what I've found is that going through my own footnotes and looking for which of these things really belong in the main text is always helpful. So that's just like a small writerly note, because you've written actually as a footnote a very good argument for why you are opposed to a certain kind of comfort. You've written a good 3-part argument for why we should be open to discomfort. And I would suggest that argument, in fact, broadly belongs up here. Now, again, though, I'm gonna come back here and kind of wonder how some of this discomfort does or should work in multilateral and mass-mediated contexts, and in what we might want to call hyper-mediated contexts. So when you're, for instance, looking at a meme, which is by definition a repetitive piece of cultural production that signifies differently over time and often has traveled a long ways from where it started before it reaches you, should you be doing the same thing with your discomfort under those conditions that you should be doing with your discomfort when you're having a face-to-face argument with somebody? And if not, what's the difference? And if actually the same principle holds, why does it hold in these seemingly very different contexts? Why are these different contexts actually not nearly as different as they seem? So to be clear, I don't have somewhere that I want you specifically to end up on that question, just that I'm looking forward to seeing how you would address it when you come to think about digital contexts specifically. And I love your closing with a recanting. And I think I would push you to take this recanting, this idea, where you come back to say, actually, we shouldn't always be compromising. I'd push you to say something about what that means for what we think good argument is. And I'd like to hear here maybe a little bit more about what are the things that good argument should do along the way. I mean, you give us a really lovely sense here of what argument is for. It's theoretically, genuinely, I say this quite seriously, it's a theoretically rich vision of what argument is for, which is awesome. And I'd like to see a little bit more of how you cash that out in what a good argument does and doesn't do, and what bad argument does and doesn't do. We've got some of that in terms of staying with the discomfort, staying with the trouble. But I want to push you to think a little bit more, even in a sort of a procedural way. How concretely does and doesn't good argument cash out this overarching set of theoretical principles or ideas. So, as you move forward, I'm really looking forward to continuing to read you and to talk with you about your work. I hope you'll reach out, come see me in office hours, make an appointment to see me some other time outside of office hours. And yeah, I look forward to talking more. Thanks.